So there's been a lot going on over this last week. If you saw my last video, we were starting on 2 special projects, and check that out if you want to see more. I'm going to give you a quick update with those projects. I've also got quite a few other things, non-music related, that I want to do. The weather is gradually moving away from winter. It's still frozen in the morning, but the sun has been coming out, which has been great. So I'm going to go do some yoga with my brother just now, and I've got a lo-fi trap beat to show you.
Felt like I would be the only one out on my own, but what about you? And oh, I hide sometimes, scared to lose this dream. Then I realize you're reminding me that Earth's be like here, nebulous collide, and I'm running out of words as the night sky said.
Here is the space that we have created to put the foundation in for the gym, and we're moving this shed down here so that this can become Corley's summer bedroom. Corley's bedroom will become my room, and then my room will become the music studio for my brother Osh. So lots to do. Better get on with it. So, whilst Carpenter Kobe is working with the crew to get the other shed put up and all of the other things rolling, I am going to show you this lo-fi trap beat. There's a lot of pop influences in this too, but it's predominantly lo-fi sounds mixed with trap sounds. And I want to show you some of the tips and tricks I use to take a simple drum beat and chord progression and turn it into something that's still simple with lots of room for the vocals to go on top of, but it's got lots of character, energy, and pop without sounding too chaotic or overproduced. And this is what I mean. The first thing that I started with was this guitar chord progression. And first off, it's just 3 simple chords, except there's a subtle difference in the chord progression, whereby instead of just following the major or minor chord as it is, I keep the top voicing from the initial chord, those 3 notes, and I only move down the root note. It kind of keeps it slightly higher and just changes the overall energy. It makes that chord progression sound a little less basic, and then it drops down to the way that I've played it. I've been quite abrupt with the rhythm so that I can then tie in the drums and the 808s with that rhythm. So instead of just holding the notes out, I've made it pop a little bit more, knowing that that's what the drums and the 808 are going to do when I put them all together as well. There's nice space in between them where the drums could come on and off, and there's a sort of bounce already. And if you listen to a wider range of trap beats that have guitar chord progressions in them, they are usually pretty simple, but they've got a couple of subtle things that give them some nice character, but they're not crazy complex. For the processing of that guitar, taken away quite a lot of the high end and just really enclosed the overall EQ there. I then just sent it to 2 different delays and some reverb just to spice it up a bit, and distorted that delay just to give it even more character and give it that nice tone. Now onto the drums, the main and most important part of all of this. Much like the guitar, I've started off with a simple pattern with the kick and the snare. Importantly, the tempo is at 160, which again can half down to 80, so it feels like you've got that slower boom cha boom boom cha, but then you've got this double time in the middle where you've got lots of space to put hi-hats that are actually going at 160. No, so the tempo in itself is really important. I went for a nice warm thuddy kick with some nice high end. And then the snare, I've gone for, it's kind of like a clack clap, but I've layered two sounds. You'll notice in the MIDI, I haven't put the snare bang on the line. I've actually pulled it forward ever so slightly. If I moved them all back onto the line and played it, you'll see the difference. It just feels slightly lethargic and too slow, like it's not quite in the groove, and that is just because of the nature of the snare sound. You can see it's almost got two different sounds to it, and the sound that matters the most is this secondary one. The first one adds more character to the sound, but the most important part of that sound is the second half. That's why I moved it forward ever so slightly, so that it was the second half that's hitting on that line, and the first part just comes in slightly early. It makes everything a little bit tighter and fits everything into the pocket much better. I then just built on that with an extremely complex hi-hat pattern. So once I had my kick, snare and hat, I then just added in some shakers and a tonal tom just to add a little bit of character. And I made sure that this tom, I pitched it right up. It was on a D sharp and it's up to a G sharp, I think. That is the simple drum pattern, which I would have in the verses, and it just goes along with the guitar. And I've specifically left it pretty much empty and not really added anything else, because I know that I'd quite like to make ambiences with my vocals. Now we get into the chorus drums, where I've taken the original pattern that I just showed you, but developed on it even further. I really tried to challenge myself to think, how do I want this drum beat to move me? Rather than just throwing down kicks and hats and snares and just hoping that it would piece together, I tried to really pay attention to how each element that I was adding in made me feel, how my body responded to it being there. The kick and snare patterns stay the same, but I've swapped out the snare for a bigger, crunchier one, which is more of a trap style snare, and paired it with a click. When you layer those three sounds together, you get a really strong sound, and paired it with a kick. But you notice there's no tail on any of those snare sounds. They cut off really abruptly. I felt that worked really well with the guitar strike. Dum cha, dum dum cha. Then I just went to town adding a bunch of other hats, shakers, tonal toms. So I kept the same hats, but I also added in I kept the same shakers and the same tonal tom, but this time with the tonal tom, I actually ran it through Valhalla Supermassive to get some really cool delay effect. So the raw sound just sounds like that. I sent it to this drum effects bus and added Valhalla Supermassive, and then automated the delay so that it would come up and down, and then reversed that sound as well. So you can hear the tail of this sound, it slides down. That creates some nice movement or direction that the drums feel like they're going in. I'll probably experiment with that a little bit more, because it's a really fun way to create some cool, more unique sounds to layer in with your drums. So of course, Valhalla Supermassive is free, so if you haven't downloaded it yet and started playing around, what are you doing? I've then taken some other really crispy foley sounds and just used them to thicken out the character and the overall sound. There's some sounds from a deck of cards being shuffled. There's a stick hit. Layering those sounds with the kick and the snare just adds even more character. I put that reverse chord sound on every second snare to emphasize the overall phrasing of the drum beat. I've then also taken some keys jangling. Now when you listen to the keys, it's like they're being thrown up and then caught. And so it feels like the drums are being thrown up and then caught, and it gives even more movement. So here I've cut it up, the kick throws it up, and the snare reels it back in. So yeah, I was experimenting with some other crunching sounds, but I found that it made it too overcrowded. I gave myself some space from it. When I came back and listened to it, I didn't enjoy what that was doing to the overall sound, but everything else was working really well. I also added in a crispier shaker that comes in more regularly than the previous shaker. And the last thing that I added was actually what I've called chicka, which is just me going chick, 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 and I've pushed them hard left and right to create lots of width with the overall drum sound. And I've also used Little Altar Boy to push the formant down so that it feels a little heavier, because if it pushes the formant down, it goes. And I could have maybe just tried to do that, but I found it was quicker and easier to do it with a Little Altar Boy. And I could also push it right up if I wanted to change the energy and make it feel a bit brighter. I might even automate that when it comes to the final sound. It just depends on how it all pairs with the final vocals. Pairing all of those sounds together and you get... The important thing when mixing all of these sounds is that you make sure you know what your key elements are, and you don't let the other Foley sounds and the sound effects that you add around it get too loud, because then you lose your foundation, which is the kick and the snare. Then pairing together an 808 with that was relatively easy, because the drums were hitting hard enough that the 808 was bound to go well. The most simple version of this, there are just 3 chords. G sharp, the D sharp, and then the C sharp. But I've split the C sharp between the 2 octaves. So I go up to the higher octave to begin with, and then it drops right down and it just hits home that is the end of the phrase before it then goes back up to the G sharp. I wanted it not to slide between this D sharp and the D. I wanted it to be hitting much harder. But then I built on that pattern by adding in a couple of different slides. Those go a long way to just adding even more character to that 808. Speaking of adding character to the 808, when I was mixing it together, you'd often just think that an 808 sounds cool because there's lots of bass in it and it goes ooh, ooh. But actually, a lot of what gives the 808 character is what's happening up in the high end, whether there's some nice mid to high rumble there. Most 808s will sound pretty much the same down in the low end, and if you cut enough of it away, you won't necessarily be able to tell much of a difference between the 808s. It just sounds like a sub. What gives the 808 its character is how long it's played for, how hard the transient comes, and what's going on up in the high end. So what I did is I added a wave shaper, just to add a little bit more aggressiveness to the overall sound, then added the serum effects and put a downsample on it, so that there's a little bit of bit crush or distortion. Gives you a really good idea of what it sounds like. Now if I bring the bass back in, didn't want it to be overpowering, because of course you still want the main focus of the 808 to be the low end, but it just gives it a bit more presence mixed in with all the other drum sounds. So with both of the distortions that I've added on turned off, still sounds quite good. The original 808 sample that I got from the Sticky Pandora pack is a really nice 808, but when you add those other 2 distortions back in, that character just comes through a little stronger. Then the only other 2 instrumental elements that I added in was just this spacious ARP sound that I've thrown in the background that just follows the chord progression. I've really been falling in love with using ARP sounds right now to create really nice ambiences and atmospheres. Instead of just holding chords, you can put the ARP in the background but just turn it down so that it's not overpowering everything. And I just made sure to really layer up the chords so that I had some 7th and 9th notes in there. I also just added some pizzicato strings. These of course came from the Spitfire BBC Orchestra, which again is free and I'll link it down below. So they're not really a counter melody, they actually follow relatively closely what the guitar is doing, or they hit at the same time. What I will do for you in the next video is I will create a vocal arrangement with pads, harmonies, layers, atmospheres, ad-libs, and then a full vocal line, all going to plan. I've purposefully made this so that there's still plenty of space to throw in a vocal idea too. So I hope you found this breakdown valuable, and if you did, you know what to do. I'm really excited to share the next video with you, and you can probably click on one of those right now, but until then, believe in yourself and you will be unstoppable. Bye!